Hi, I'm Kieran Draveth. At my uncle's funeral, my family didn't just ignore me. They banned me from attending. My mother, Celine, told the funeral director I was insignificant and had no place among successful people. My sister Isabella laughed when I showed up anyway, saying I was embarrassing myself by pretending to belong. My cousins blocked the entrance like security guards, treating me like some unwanted stranger who'd crashed a private event. But what if I told you they were the ones living a lie, and my uncle Viktor knew it all along? Now the question isn't why they excluded me from saying goodbye. It's why they were so desperate to keep me away from the reading of his will. Because when that envelope was opened, everything they thought they knew about our family's billion-dollar pharmaceutical empire crumbled. And the person they called insignificant became the one person who held all the power. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn rain hammered against the stained glass windows of Blackwater Memorial Chapel like nature itself was mourning Uncle Viktor's passing. I sat in my beat-up Honda Civic in the parking lot, watching through the windshield as mourners in $1,000 suits filed past the bronze doors. Every face I recognized. Every face that had once smiled at me during family gatherings before I became the embarrassment they pretended didn't exist. The chapel loomed before me like a fortress built from old money and older secrets. Viktor Draveth, founder and CEO of Draveth Pharmaceuticals, lay inside that building, and I wasn't allowed to say goodbye to the only person who'd ever believed in me. My phone had been buzzing all morning with messages I didn't want to read but couldn't ignore. The first one came at 7 a.m. from my mother, Celine. "Don't even think about showing up today. This is for family only." The second arrived an hour later from my sister, Isabella. "Seriously, Kieran, you'll just make it awkward for everyone who actually matters." But the one that stung the most was from my cousin Tavrik, Viktor's own son. "Security has your photo. Try anything and you'll be escorted out in handcuffs." I adjusted the rearview mirror and caught sight of my reflection. The same dark eyes Viktor had, the same stubborn jawline that ran in the Draveth bloodline. Yet somehow I'd become the defective branch on the family tree, the one they'd rather prune away entirely. My suit was a discount store special, wrinkled from being stuffed in the back of my closet for the past 2 years. The last time I'd worn it was to Viktor's 70th birthday party, where I'd stood in the corner nursing a single beer, while everyone else celebrated the man who'd built a pharmaceutical empire from nothing. Even then I could feel the eyes on me, the whispered conversations that stopped when I walked by. "That's Kieran," they'd say, "Viktor's nephew. The one who never amounted to anything." They weren't entirely wrong. At 32, I was a part-time bookkeeper for a small accounting firm in the industrial district of Millbrook, the kind of neighborhood where the Draveth family's limousines never ventured. I lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, drove a car that needed a new transmission, and hadn't been invited to a family function in over 3 years. But Viktor had been different. While the rest of the family saw me as dead weight, he'd slip me his business card during chance encounters and tell me to call him if I ever needed anything. "You've got good eyes, Kieran," he'd say. "You see things others miss. That's worth more than all their fancy degrees combined." I never called. I was too proud, too stubborn, too afraid of being another burden on the only relative who didn't look at me like I was wearing a neon sign that read disappointment. Now he was gone, and I was sitting outside his funeral like some kind of stalker. A black Mercedes pulled into the space beside me, and I recognized the license plate immediately, DRAETH1. My father, Sandro Dramir, stepped out wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than I made in 6 months. He didn't notice me at first, too busy straightening his tie and checking his Rolex. When his eyes finally landed on my Honda, his expression shifted from indifference to disgust. He walked over and tapped on my window. I rolled it down halfway, letting in the cold October air. "What are you doing here, Kieran?" "Paying my respects to Uncle Viktor." "You weren't invited." His voice carried that familiar tone of barely contained irritation that I'd grown up with. "This is a private service for people who actually contributed to Viktor's life, people who built something meaningful." He was my uncle too. Biologically, yes, but family is about more than blood. It's about respect, achievement, carrying on a legacy. He glanced at my car with obvious distaste. "Look at yourself. Look at what you've become. Viktor died surrounded by people who honored his memory through their own success. You honor nothing." The words hit like they always did, settling somewhere deep in my chest where all the other disappointments lived. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the finality of Viktor's death, or maybe I'd finally reached the limit of how much shame one person could absorb. "I'm going in," I said quietly. Sandra's laugh was sharp and humorless. "No, you're not. Security has been instructed to remove you if you try. Celine made sure of that." "Let them try." I rolled up the window and stepped out of the car. Sandro moved to block my path, but I was 6 inches taller and 30 years younger. He stepped aside with a look that promised consequences. The walk to the chapel doors felt like crossing a minefield. I could see faces turning in my direction through the windows, phones being pulled out, hushed conversations beginning. By the time I reached the entrance, a small crowd had gathered inside, all watching to see what would happen next. The funeral director, a thin man with silver hair and nervous eyes, appeared at the door. "I'm sorry, sir, but this is a private service. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." "I'm Viktor Draveth's nephew." "I understand, sir, but we have specific instructions." "From who?" "The immediate family has requested." "I am immediate family." The director looked past me, searching for backup, and found it in the form of Tavrik Holtro, my cousin, Viktor's son and heir to the pharmaceutical empire. Tavrik approached with the confident stride of someone who'd never been told no about anything that mattered. "Kieran," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I thought we made this clear. You're not welcome here. Viktor was my uncle. Viktor was embarrassed by you." Tavrik's words carried across the chapel's foyer, silencing conversations. Do you think he wanted his funeral turned into a circus because his failure of a nephew decided to make a scene? I felt every eye in the building on me. The pharmaceutical executives who'd built fortunes on Viktor's innovations. The politicians who'd courted his endorsements. The socialites who'd competed for invitations to his charity galas. All of them watching the family disappointment get humiliated one final time. He never said that to me. He didn't have to. Actions speak louder than words, don't they? When was the last time you were invited to anything? When was the last time Viktor called you, visited you, included you in any decision that mattered? The questions hung in the air because we both knew the answers. Viktor had been kind to me, but kindness wasn't the same as inclusion. Sympathy wasn't the same as respect. "I'm still family," I said, but the words sounded hollow even to me. Family supports each other. Family builds each other up. Family creates something lasting. Tavrik gestured toward the chapel's interior, where Viktor's casket sat surrounded by flowers that cost more than my monthly rent. "Look around, Kieran. Everyone here earned their place, through achievement, through contribution, through making Viktor proud. What have you ever done except disappoint him?" I wanted to answer, wanted to defend myself, wanted to find some dignity in this moment. But the truth was a heavy weight in my chest. I had nothing, no achievements, no contributions, no legacy worthy of standing beside Viktor's casket. The funeral director cleared his throat. "Sir, I really must insist." "It's fine," I said, stepping backward. "I'll go." Tavrik's smile was triumphant and cruel. Good choice, for once. I walked back to my car under the weight of dozens of stares, each one confirming what I'd always suspected. I didn't belong here. Maybe I didn't belong anywhere. As I drove away from Blackwater Memorial Chapel, I couldn't know that inside the building, tucked into Viktor's suit pocket, was a letter with my name on it. I couldn't know that the will reading scheduled for the next morning would change everything. I couldn't know that the man they'd spent the last hour eulogizing as a brilliant businessman had been playing a game none of them understood. All I knew was that I'd been excluded from saying goodbye to the only person who'd ever seen potential in me. What I didn't know was that he'd been planning for this moment longer than any of them could imagine. 24 hours later, I sat in the waiting room of Thornfield Legal Associates, staring at the same mahogany walls that had witnessed decades of Draveth family business. The leather chairs were the kind that probably cost more than my car, and the Persian rug under my feet looked like it belonged in a museum. Everything screamed old money and established power, the kind of environment where I usually felt like an intruder. But today was different. Today I'd received a call from Maeva Linthorne, Viktor's estate attorney, informing me that my presence was required for the reading of the will. Not requested. Required. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mr. Draveth. She'd said over the phone, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came with decades of managing wealthy families' secrets. Viktor's will contains specific provisions that necessitate your attendance. Please be at our offices tomorrow at 10 a.m. sharp. I'd almost laughed. After being banned from the funeral, the idea that I was suddenly essential to anything involving Viktor's estate felt like some kind of cosmic joke. But Maeva Linthorn didn't strike me as someone who made jokes about legal matters. The waiting room began to fill with familiar faces as 10 o'clock approached. My mother, Celine, arrived first, draped in black Chanel and wearing the kind of grief that looked expensive. She glanced at me with the same expression she might give a stain on her carpet. "What are you doing here?" she asked, settling into a chair as far from me as the room's geography allowed. "I was invited." "That's impossible. Viktor wouldn't—" She stopped herself, but I could fill in the rest. Viktor wouldn't waste time on the family disappointment, not even in death. Isabella swept in next, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor with the rhythm of someone who'd never questioned their place in the world. At 29, she was 3 years younger than me but lived a life that belonged to a different universe entirely. Harvard MBA, vice president of strategic development at Draveth Pharmaceuticals, married to a hedge fund manager whose family owned half of Thornfield Heights. She took one look at me and shook her head. "This is inappropriate, Kieran, even for you." "I didn't ask to be here." "Then why are you?" Before I could answer, the rest of the family arrived in a convoy of luxury vehicles that probably represented more wealth than most people saw in a lifetime. Tavrik entered with his usual swagger, followed by his wife Alaya, whose jewelry collection could have funded a small country's healthcare system. My aunt Solara came next, Viktor's sister, accompanied by her son Daryl, a pharmaceutical patent attorney who'd made a career out of protecting the family's intellectual property. The room felt smaller with each arrival, the air growing thicker with designer perfumes and expensive cologne. Conversations flowed around me but never included me, as if I existed in some parallel dimension where voices couldn't reach. "Viktor's portfolio alone is worth $800 million, Tavrik was saying to Daryl. "That's not counting the pharmaceutical patents, the real estate holdings, or the offshore accounts." "The company valuation came in at just over $2 billion last quarter," Isabella added. "With Viktor gone, the board will need decisive leadership, someone who understands the legacy he built." Aliyah nodded thoughtfully. "The Thornfield mansion alone is worth $40 million, and that's before you consider the art collection." They spoke about Viktor's wealth like children dividing up candy, each one calculating their expected share. I'd grown up watching this same dynamic play out at every family gathering. The careful positioning, the subtle jockeying for favor, the unspoken understanding that everything was a transaction. What struck me was how seamlessly they'd moved from mourning to mathematics. Less than 24 hours after laying Viktor to rest, they were already measuring his life in dollars and assets. "The pharmaceutical division alone generates over $300 million annually," Daryl was explaining to Celine. "Viktor built something extraordinary. It needs to be protected by people who understand its value." Celine's eyes found mine across the room. "Some people understand value, others just take up space." The comment was loud enough for everyone to hear, designed to remind the room that I didn't belong among the calculators and inheritors. A few polite chuckles followed, the kind that wealthy people use to acknowledge cruelty without getting their hands dirty. At exactly 10 a.m., Maeva Linthorn emerged from her office. She was a woman in her mid-60s, with silver hair, pulled back in a severe bun, and glasses that made her eyes look larger than they were. Everything about her posture suggested someone who'd spent decades delivering news that rich people didn't want to hear. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice cutting through the conversations like a blade. "Viktor's final wishes are quite specific, and today we'll be carrying them out to the letter." She gestured toward the conference room. "Please, everyone take a seat." The conference room was even more intimidating than the waiting room. A massive table dominated the center, surrounded by chairs that looked like thrones. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Thornfield Heights' most exclusive neighborhood, where houses started at $10 million and climbed from there. I found myself at the far end of the table, as physically removed from the center of power as the room's design allowed. The others arranged themselves by perceived importance: Celine and Isabella nearest to Maeva, followed by Tavrik and Alaya, then the various cousins and in-laws who'd married their way into the Draveth dynasty. Maeva placed a thick folder on the table and opened it with the ceremony of someone unveiling a sacred text. Viktor Draveth's last will and testament was signed and notarized 6 weeks before his passing. It was updated from his previous will, which had been in place for over a decade. Tavrik leaned forward. What kind of updates? Substantial ones. Maeva's eyes swept the room. Viktor was very clear about his intentions and very specific about how those intentions should be communicated. She pulled out a sealed envelope. Before we proceed to the distribution of assets, Viktor requested that this letter be read aloud to everyone present. Celine shifted in her chair. Is that really necessary? We all understand Viktor's values. Surely we can move on to the practical matters. Viktor's wishes were explicit. Maeva broke the seal and unfolded a single sheet of expensive stationery. This letter is addressed to the family as a whole. She cleared her throat and began to read in Viktor's voice, or at least the voice I remembered from family dinners and business meetings. If you're hearing this, then I've passed on, and you're all gathered together for the first time in years without me as a buffer. I suspect you've already begun calculating your expected inheritances, measuring my life's work in terms of your personal gain. This letter is meant to remind you that some things are worth more than money, though I doubt most of you will understand that distinction. The room had gone completely silent. Even the traffic noise from the street seemed to have faded. I built Draveth Pharmaceuticals to heal people, to advance medicine, to leave the world better than I found it. Some of you have honored that mission. Others have treated it as a means to fund lifestyles that would embarrass more modest families. I've watched my own blood turn my company into a social ladder, using my achievements to justify their own sense of superiority. Isabella's face had gone pale. Tavrik's confident expression was beginning to crack. I've also watched some of you exclude, diminish, and humiliate family members who didn't meet your standards of success. You've created a hierarchy based on wealth and status, forgetting that character matters more than career achievement. You've forgotten that kindness matters more than credentials. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me, but I kept my gaze fixed on the table. This brings me to the central point of this letter. For the past 15 years, you've treated one member of our family as an embarrassment, a burden, someone unworthy of inclusion in your elite circle. You've mocked his career choices, excluded him from gatherings, and made it clear that his presence was unwelcome at family events. Maeva paused, glancing up at the faces around the table before continuing. What you never bothered to learn was that this person possessed the one quality I valued above all others: integrity. While you were building careers on my foundation, he was building character on his own. While you were spending money you hadn't earned, he was earning respect through honest work. While you were judging others by their bank accounts, he was treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their station. The silence in the room was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel sweat beginning to form on my palms. You excluded him from my funeral because you deemed him insignificant. You told him he had no place among successful people. You treated him like a stranger who'd crashed a private event. Maeva's voice grew stronger, as if Viktor's indignation was flowing through her. What you failed to understand was that he was the only one among you who truly understood what success means. Not the accumulation of wealth, but the accumulation of wisdom. Not the building of empires, but the building of character. Not the pursuit of status, but the pursuit of truth. I looked up to find Celine staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not disgust or disappointment, but something closer to fear. This letter serves as both explanation and warning. My will reflects my values, not your expectations. My legacy will be determined by character, not by birth order or career achievement. Those who have shown compassion will be rewarded with trust. Those who have shown cruelty will learn the cost of their choices. The letter ended there, leaving the room in a silence so complete it felt solid. Maeva folded the paper and set it aside. Now, shall we proceed to the distribution of assets? But I could tell from the faces around the table that everyone already understood the game had changed completely. They just didn't know how much. Maeva reached into the folder and withdrew a document bound in dark blue leather, the kind of binding that suggested importance, permanence, the weight of decisions that would outlast everyone in the room. The last will and testament of Viktor Alexander Draveth, she announced. her voice carrying the formality of someone who'd presided over the redistribution of wealth for decades. Tavrik straightened in his chair. As Viktor's only son, he'd spent his entire adult life being groomed to inherit not just money, but an empire. Draveth Pharmaceuticals had been his birthright, his destiny, the foundation upon which he'd built his identity and his future. "Let's begin with the corporate holdings," Maeva continued, flipping to the first page. Viktor's shares in Draveth Pharmaceuticals, representing 68% ownership of the company, with a current estimated value of $1.4 billion. The numbers hung in the air like smoke. Even I, with my basic understanding of finance, could grasp the magnitude. Viktor hadn't just been wealthy, he'd been impossibly generationally wealthy. "These shares are bequeathed to," Maeva paused, glancing around the table as if to ensure everyone was paying attention, "Kieran Draveth, son of Sandro Dramir and Celine Thelriche Draveth." The words hit the room like a physical force. I watched Tavrik's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and then something approaching panic. Isabella's mouth fell open. Celine gripped her purse so tightly her knuckles went white. "I'm sorry," Tavrik said, his voice cracking slightly. "Could you repeat that?" "Viktor's controlling stake in Draveth Pharmaceuticals has been left to Kieran." "That's impossible." The words came out louder than Tavrik probably intended. "There has to be a mistake. I'm Viktor's son. I've worked at the company for 15 years. I've been CEO in training since I graduated from Wharton." Maeva's expression didn't change. The will is quite clear. Viktor spent considerable time ensuring his intentions were properly documented. Darryl leaned forward, his patent attorney training kicking in. "We'll need to see the original document. This version could be fraudulent, or Viktor might have been suffering from diminished capacity when he signed it." The will was prepared by this firm, signed in this office, with 2 partners serving as witnesses. Viktor's mental capacity was assessed by 3 independent physicians, all of whom certified his competency. Maeva's tone carried the patience of someone who'd dealt with shocked inheritors before. "I can assure you this document will withstand any legal challenge." I sat frozen in my chair, trying to process what I'd just heard. 2 days ago, I'd been banned from Viktor's funeral as an embarrassment to the family. Now I apparently owned the company that had made the Draveth name synonymous with pharmaceutical innovation. "This is insane," Isabella said, finding her voice. "Kieran doesn't know anything about running a business. He's a part-time bookkeeper who lives above a laundromat." Viktor's decision was made with full knowledge of Kieran's current circumstances, Maeva replied evenly. Celine finally spoke, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. Viktor was being manipulated. Kieran must have influenced him somehow, taken advantage of an elderly man's emotions. "When?" I asked quietly. "When did I manipulate him? When did I even see him?" "You've spent the last 3 years making sure I was excluded from every family event, every gathering, every opportunity to spend time with him." The truth of that statement settled over the room like a heavy blanket. They couldn't claim I'd manipulated Viktor when they'd gone to such lengths to keep us apart. Tavrik stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I don't care what that document says. I've dedicated my life to Draveth Pharmaceuticals. I know every aspect of the business, every department head, every major client. I have relationships with regulatory agencies, partnership agreements with research institutions, strategic plans extending 5 years into the future." He pointed at me with a trembling finger. "He doesn't even know what we manufacture. He probably couldn't name 3 of our products if his life depended on it." Tavrik wasn't wrong. My knowledge of Draveth Pharmaceuticals extended to what I'd overheard at family dinners and what I'd read in business magazines. I knew they made drugs, I knew they made money, and I knew they made the family wealthy enough to treat people like me as disposable. Viktor's decision suggests he valued different qualifications than business expertise, Maeva said diplomatically. "What qualifications?" Alaya demanded. "What has Kieran ever accomplished that would justify this?" Maeva turned to the next page of the will. Perhaps Viktor's own words will provide clarification. He included specific explanations for his major bequests. She located the relevant section and began reading. "Regarding the transfer of corporate control to Kieran Draveth, I have watched my family for decades, observing how they treat success, failure, and each other. I have seen kindness and cruelty, generosity and selfishness, wisdom and arrogance. The person I am entrusting with my life's work possesses the rarest quality in our family, the ability to see people as human beings rather than stepping stones or obstacles." The room was silent, except for the sound of expensive watches ticking. Kieran has never asked me for money, never leveraged our relationship for personal gain, never treated my success as his inheritance. When others were building careers on my foundation, he was building character on his own. When others were using my name to open doors, he was earning respect through his own efforts, however modest those efforts might appear to people who measure worth in dollars. I felt heat rising in my cheeks. Viktor's words were generous, but they also highlighted just how little I'd achieved compared to everyone else in the room. Business skills can be learned. Leadership techniques can be taught. Financial acumen can be developed. But character is forged through experience, tested through adversity, and proven through choices made when no one is watching. Kieran has been tested by rejection, humiliation, and exclusion. He has chosen dignity over resentment, kindness over bitterness, integrity over revenge. Maeva looked up from the document. Viktor goes on to explain that he's established a transition team to help Kieran learn the business aspects of running Draveth Pharmaceuticals, but that the fundamental decisions about the company's direction and values will be his to make. Tavrik sank back into his chair, looking like someone who'd just watched his entire future evaporate. 15 years, he whispered. 15 years I've worked toward this. The will does provide for other family members, Maeva continued, flipping through several pages. Tavrik, you receive $5 million in Viktor's collection of vintage pharmaceuticals equipment, along with a recommendation letter for any position you might seek in the industry. $5 million would be life-changing money for most people. In this room, it felt like an insult. Isabella, you receive $3 million in Viktor's art collection, valued at approximately $8 million. Isabella's face had gone ashen. $11 million was substantial, but she'd been expecting a significant stake in the company where she'd built her career. Celine, you received $2 million and Viktor's home in the Hamptons. My mother's inheritance was generous by any normal standard, but I could see the calculation in her eyes. She'd been counting on much more. Maeva continued down the list, distributing millions to various family members who now looked like lottery winners who just learned their tickets were worth less than they'd hoped. But the real shock came when she reached the final page. In addition to the corporate shares, Kieran inherits Viktor's personal residence at 47 Thornfield Manor Drive, valued at $42 million, along with all contents. The investment portfolio, currently valued at approximately $600 million. The pharmaceutical patent portfolio, with an estimated value of $300 million. And finally, liquid assets totaling $120 million. I stopped breathing. The numbers were so large they felt abstract, like someone was reading the budget of a small country rather than describing my inheritance. The total value of assets bequeathed to Kieran Draveth is approximately $2.5 billion, making this one of the largest individual inheritances in the state's history. The silence that followed felt like the moment between lightning and thunder, when the world holds its breath waiting for the sound that will confirm everything has changed. Then Celine exploded. "This is theft," she screamed, standing so quickly her chair toppled backward. Legal theft orchestrated by a bitter old man who wanted to destroy his own family. Viktor wasn't bitter, I said quietly. He was disappointed. "Shut up," Isabella snapped. "You don't get to speak for him. You barely knew him." "I knew him better than you think." "When?" Tavrik demanded. "When did you spend time with Viktor? When did you earn this kind of trust? When did you prove you deserve to inherit what I've spent my life building?" That's when Maeva cleared her throat and reached into her folder one more time. "Actually," she said, withdrawing a small digital recorder, "Viktor anticipated these questions. He left something else for today's meeting." She pressed play, and Viktor's voice filled the room, clear and strong, as if he were sitting at the table with us. "If you're hearing this recording, then Kieran now owns controlling interest in Draveth Pharmaceuticals, and the rest of you are reacting about as poorly as I expected." Even from beyond the grave, Viktor's timing was perfect. "What none of you know is that Kieran and I have been meeting regularly for the past 2 years, not at family functions where you could monitor and judge our interactions, but privately, quietly, in ways that allowed me to see who he really is when he's not being scrutinized by people who've already decided he's worthless. The recording continued, but I couldn't focus on Viktor's words. All I could think about were those Saturday afternoons I'd assumed were coincidental encounters. Viktor appearing at the coffee shop where I did freelance bookkeeping. Running into him at the park where I walked to clear my head. Those conversations about business, life, family, and character that I'd treasured as moments of connection with the only relative who seemed to see value in me. They hadn't been coincidences at all. Viktor had been evaluating me for the most important job interview of my life, and I'd never even realized I was being tested. Viktor's voice continued from the recorder, filling the stunned silence with words that would reshape everything I thought I knew about the last 2 years of my life. The first time I approached Kieran was at Morrison's Coffee House on 5th Street. He was there doing bookkeeping for a small restaurant chain, working on a Saturday afternoon while most people his age were enjoying their weekend. I pretended it was a chance encounter, ordered my coffee, and struck up a conversation about the business section of the newspaper he was reading. I remembered that day perfectly. It was 18 months ago, middle of summer, and I'd been reconciling inventory reports for a client who paid me $20 an hour to work weekends. Viktor had appeared like some kind of apparition from my childhood, impeccably dressed even on a Saturday, carrying himself with the quiet authority that had built an empire. We talked for 2 hours, Viktor's voice continued. About pharmaceutical regulations, about healthcare costs, about the responsibility that comes with developing medicines that people depend on for their lives. What struck me wasn't his business knowledge, though he understood more than anyone gave him credit for, but his perspective. When I mentioned the company's profit margins, his first question wasn't about shareholder value or market expansion. It was about whether our pricing made our drugs accessible to people who needed them. The family members around the table were staring at me like I'd somehow become a different person in the span of minutes. Tavrek's expression had shifted from anger to something approaching bewilderment. That conversation led to others. Always casual, always initiated by me, always designed to let me see how his mind worked, without the pressure of knowing he was being evaluated. I'd suggest meeting at the Botanical Gardens to discuss a business article I'd read. I'd invite him to lunch under the pretense of wanting company. I'd call him when I needed someone to help me think through ethical questions that kept me awake at night. Isabella was shaking her head slowly, as if rejecting the possibility that these meetings had ever taken place. For 18 months, I watched Kieran demonstrate qualities that I'd been hoping to find in my own family for decades. When I told him about a pharmaceutical company in Africa that needed funding to develop malaria treatments, he didn't ask about the return on investment. He asked how quickly the funding could be arranged. When I described a regulatory battle that would cost millions to fight, he didn't suggest finding legal loopholes. He asked whether we were fighting for something that would genuinely help patients, or just protect profits. Viktor's voice carried a warmth that I'd rarely heard during family gatherings, where conversations were always tinged with the subtle tensions that wealth creates between people who should love each other unconditionally. I began bringing him files to review, ostensibly for his bookkeeping expertise, but really to see how he'd approach complex business problems. I'd present hypothetical scenarios about corporate governance, research and development priorities, mergers and acquisitions. His responses consistently surprised me, not because they were sophisticated, though they often were, but because they were grounded in principles rather than profit calculations. Maeva paused the recording and looked around the table. Viktor documented each of these meetings in detail. We have written records of conversations, copies of the business analyses Kieran provided, and video recordings of some of their discussions. This wasn't a sentimental decision made in Viktor's final days. It was the result of careful evaluation over an extended period. Celine found her voice first. If these meetings were so important, why didn't Viktor tell us about them? Why the secrecy? Maeva pressed play again, and Viktor answered as if he'd anticipated the question. I kept these meetings private because I wanted to observe Kieran's character without the distortion that family dynamics create. You've all spent years telling him he's worthless, treating him like an embarrassment, excluding him from opportunities to prove himself. I wanted to see who he really was when he wasn't carrying the weight of your expectations and disappointments. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Everyone in the room had participated in my exclusion to some degree, and now they were being forced to confront the consequences of their collective judgment. More importantly, I wanted to protect him from the kind of manipulation that wealth creates in families like ours. If Kieran had known he was being considered as my heir, every interaction between us would have been contaminated by that knowledge. He couldn't have shown me his authentic self if he'd been performing for an inheritance. Viktor's strategy was brilliant and cruel in equal measure. He'd given me the chance to be myself while ensuring that everyone else had to confront their own behavior without the excuse of ignorance. The results of this evaluation exceeded my expectations. Kieran didn't just demonstrate good judgment and strong character. He showed me something I'd begun to fear was extinct in our family: the ability to see wealth as a tool rather than a trophy. When I asked him what he'd do with unlimited resources, he didn't describe mansions or yachts or investment portfolios. He talked about research programs that could develop treatments for rare diseases. He talked about making essential medications affordable for people who couldn't otherwise access them. He talked about using pharmaceutical profits to fund medical schools in underserved communities. I remembered those conversations, remembered thinking they were purely theoretical discussions with an uncle who seemed genuinely interested in my opinions. I'd never imagined that Viktor was designing a future around my answers. But the moment that convinced me Kieran was the right choice came 6 months ago, during a discussion about corporate social responsibility. I told him about a situation where Draveth Pharmaceuticals could acquire a smaller company's patents for a fraction of their value, essentially bankrupting the smaller firm but saving us hundreds of millions in research costs. It was a perfectly legal business transaction that would have been celebrated by our shareholders and board of directors. Viktor paused on the recording, and I could picture him in his study carefully choosing words that would explain a decision no one in the room was prepared to understand. Kieran's response was immediate and uncompromising. He said that destroying another company to save money was exactly the kind of thinking that made people distrust pharmaceutical corporations. He said that if Draveth Pharmaceuticals was successful enough to acquire patents, we were successful enough to offer fair compensation that would allow the smaller company to continue operating. He said our reputation for ethical business practices was worth more than short-term savings, and that patients deserved to know their medications came from companies they could trust. Tavrik was staring at the recorder with an expression of complete disbelief. That acquisition would have saved $300 million. We decided against it, and I never understood why. Because your father asked for my opinion, I said quietly. And I told him that robbing other companies wasn't the same as competing with them. You cost us $300 million, Isabella said, her voice barely above a whisper. I saved our reputation from being worth $300 million less than it should be, I replied. Viktor's voice resumed from the recorder. That conversation made my decision final. Kieran understood something that I'd spent decades trying to teach the rest of my family: that how you make money matters as much as how much money you make. He grasped intuitively that Draveth Pharmaceuticals' value comes not just from our patents and research, but from the trust that patients and healthcare providers place in our commitment to helping rather than exploiting people. The recording continued for another 10 minutes, with Viktor describing other tests, other conversations, other moments where I'd apparently revealed aspects of my character that he'd found lacking in his biological heirs. Each anecdote felt surreal, like learning that my life had been a performance that I'd never realized I was giving. When the recording finally ended, the conference room felt smaller somehow, as if the weight of Viktor's words had compressed the air. Maeva closed the folder and folded her hands on the table. Viktor's will also include specific instructions for the transition of corporate control. Kieran, you'll be meeting with the board of directors next Monday to formally assume your role as majority shareholder and chairman of Draveth Pharmaceuticals. Viktor arranged for a management team to help you learn the operational aspects of running the company, but all major strategic decisions will ultimately be yours to make. I nodded, though the gesture felt automatic. The magnitude of what was happening still hadn't fully registered. 2 days ago, I'd been a part-time bookkeeper living paycheck to paycheck. Now I was apparently responsible for a pharmaceutical empire that employed thousands of people and affected millions of lives. The transition team includes several department heads who worked directly with Viktor, along with external consultants who specialize in corporate governance. You'll also have access to Viktor's personal notes about the company's strategic direction, ongoing research projects, and his recommendations for future development. Maeva handed me a thick portfolio. Viktor prepared this specifically for you. It contains everything you'll need to understand the current state of the company and the decisions you'll be facing in your first year as chairman. I opened the portfolio to find hundreds of pages of documents, charts, financial reports, and handwritten notes in Viktor's distinctive script. The first page was a letter addressed to me personally. "Kieran," it began, "if you're reading this, then you've inherited more than money and property. You've inherited responsibility for something I spent my life building, and trust from someone who believed you could build it into something even better." The letter continued, but I couldn't focus on the words. Around the table, I could feel the weight of stares, the silent recalculations happening behind carefully neutral expressions. Everyone was trying to process not just the financial implications of Viktor's decision, but the personal judgment it represented. He hadn't just given me his wealth. He'd used his wealth to deliver a verdict about each person in the room, about their character, their values, their worthiness to carry on his legacy. The verdict was devastating and public and irreversible. And as I sat there holding the portfolio that represented my improbable future, I realized that Viktor's generosity was also his revenge. The portfolio felt heavy in my hands as I walked through the parking garage beneath Thornfield Legal Associates. Behind me, I could hear voices echoing off the concrete walls, my family members clustering around their expensive cars, processing the morning's revelations with the kind of heated whispers that money makes urgent. I'd managed to leave the conference room without speaking to any of them, following Maeva's suggestion that everyone needed time to absorb the implications of Viktor's will before attempting family conversations that would inevitably turn destructive. But as I reached my beat-up Honda, Isabella's voice cut through the underground air. "Kieran, wait." I turned to find her walking toward me alone, her heels echoing sharply against the concrete. The others were grouped around Tavrick's Mercedes 50 feet away, watching our interaction with the intensity of people trying to read lips. "We need to talk," she said, stopping just close enough to keep her voice private. "I don't think there's much to discuss." "There's everything to discuss." Isabella's composure was cracking around the edges, revealing something I'd rarely seen in my sister: genuine distress. "This is insane, Kieran. You can't possibly believe you're qualified to run Draveth Pharmaceuticals." Viktor seemed to think I was. Viktor was sick. He was old, he was isolated, and he was being manipulated by someone who took advantage of his loneliness. I set the portfolio on my car's hood and looked directly at my sister. "When did I manipulate him, Isabella? When did I have the opportunity? You've spent years making sure I knew I wasn't welcome at family gatherings. You've excluded me from Christmas dinners, birthday parties, company events, even casual get-togethers. So tell me exactly when I was supposed to have gained this mysterious influence over Viktor." Isabella's mouth opened, then closed. We both knew she couldn't answer that question without acknowledging the systematic way the family had isolated me. "The meetings," she said finally. "Those secret meetings Viktor described, why didn't you tell us about them? Why would I? You'd already made it clear that anything I did was either insignificant or embarrassing. If I'd mentioned having coffee with Viktor, you would have found some way to turn it into evidence of my social awkwardness or his pity for the family failure." The words came out harsher than I'd intended, but they carried the weight of years of accumulated hurt. Isabella flinched as if I'd struck her. "That's not true." "Isn't it? When was the last time you invited me to anything? When was the last time you called me just to see how I was doing? When was the last time you treated me like a brother instead of an obligation?" Isabella looked away, unable to meet my eyes. The silence stretched between us until it became more honest than any words we might have spoken. "This will destroy the family," she said finally. "The family destroyed itself long before today. What's that supposed to mean?" I leaned against my car, trying to organize thoughts I'd never been forced to articulate clearly. "Do you remember the last Christmas I attended? 3 years ago, at Viktor's house?" Isabella nodded reluctantly. "I spent 2 hours in that mansion listening to everyone discuss business deals, investment strategies, real estate acquisitions, and exotic vacation plans. Not one person asked me about my life, my work, or my interests. Not one person included me in a conversation unless they needed someone to bring them a drink or move their car. I was invisible until I became useful." The memory was still sharp enough to cut. I'd sat in Viktor's living room watching my own family treat me like hired help, too polite to ask me to leave, but too embarrassed to acknowledge my presence. When I finally tried to contribute to a conversation about pharmaceutical regulations, something I actually knew about from my accounting work, Tavrick literally laughed and said, "Leave the business talk to people who understand business." You all laughed with him. Isabella's face was pale, Kieran, I don't remember. Of course you don't. It wasn't memorable for you. But for me, it was the moment I realized my own family saw me as entertainment at best and an embarrassment at worst. I opened my car door, but Isabella stepped closer. So you're going to use Viktor's money to punish us? I'm not punishing anyone. Viktor made his decision based on 18 months of private conversations that you all made possible by excluding me from public ones. He learned who I really am because you forced him to look past who you all decided I was. And who are you really? The question carried a note of desperation, as if Isabella was trying to find some version of her brother that made sense in the context of a $2 billion inheritance. I thought about Viktor's letter, about the conversations we'd had, about the tests I'd unknowingly passed. I'm someone who thinks pharmaceutical companies should prioritize patients over profits. Someone who believes wealth should be used to solve problems rather than create luxury. Someone who thinks success should be measured by positive impact rather than personal accumulation. Those are easy principles to have when you don't own anything. And they're apparently hard principles to maintain when you do. Isabella stepped back as if I'd slapped her. What's that supposed to mean? It means Viktor spent 40 years building a company that was supposed to heal people, and he watched his own family turn it into a machine for generating personal wealth. He saw his children and grandchildren treat pharmaceutical patents like lottery tickets, caring more about profit margins than patient outcomes. I gestured toward the cluster of family members still gathered around Tavrek's car. Look at them. They're not mourning Viktor or celebrating his legacy. They're calculating how to challenge his will, how to manipulate the legal system, how to reclaim what they think they deserve. Even now, even after hearing Viktor's own voice explain his reasoning, they can't accept that their character was found wanting. So you're better than all of us? I'm different from all of you. Viktor recognized that difference and decided it was worth investing in. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, studying my face as if trying to recognize someone she'd known her entire life. What happens now? She asked finally. I learned how to run a pharmaceutical company. I try to honor Viktor's trust and build something that would make him proud. And us? Your family? I looked past her toward the others, still huddled in their expensive clothes around their luxury vehicles, probably planning legal strategies and damage control measures. That depends on whether you want to be part of building something meaningful or part of tearing down something important. Isabella followed my gaze. They'll never accept this, you know. Tavrek has spent his entire adult life preparing to inherit Draveth Pharmaceuticals. Celine built her social identity around being Viktor's heir. They'll fight you in court, in the press, in every way they can imagine. I know. It's gonna get ugly. It already is ugly. At least now it's honestly ugly, instead of politely ugly. Isabella reached out as if to touch my arm, then let her hand fall. I'm sorry, Kieran. For Christmas, for the laughing, for all of it. I didn't realize. You didn't want to realize. There's a difference. She nodded slowly, accepting the distinction. What can I do to make it right? Help me build something worth inheriting. Help me prove Viktor's faith wasn't misplaced. Help me show that Draveth Pharmaceuticals can be both profitable and principled. And if I can't, if this is too hard, too complicated, too different from everything I've planned for my life, I opened my car door and slid behind the wheel. Then you'll have proven Viktor's point about the difference between wealth and character. As I drove out of the parking garage, I could see Isabella in my rearview mirror, standing alone between the expensive cars and the concrete walls, looking smaller and more uncertain than I'd ever seen her. For the first time in my life, I was the one driving away from family drama instead of being driven away from it. The difference felt significant, like a shift in gravity that would affect everything that came after. But I also knew that Isabella was right about one thing. It was going to get ugly. Viktor had given me the tools to build something meaningful, but he'd also given me enemies who had everything to lose and nothing left to protect except their pride. The real test wasn't whether I could handle a $2 billion inheritance. It was whether I could survive what my family would do to try to take it away from me. 3 days after the will reading, I discovered just how quickly wealth could turn into warfare. The first assault came through legal channels. I was reviewing Viktor's files in his study at Thornfield Manor when Maeva called with news that made my blood run cold. They've filed for an emergency injunction, she said, her usually composed voice carrying an edge of concern. Tavrek, Celine, and Isabella have retained Morrison, Blake & Associates to challenge the will's validity, They're claiming Viktor suffered from diminished mental capacity and that you exercised undue influence. I set down Viktor's notebook and walked to the window overlooking the estate's gardens. What does that mean practically? It means all assets are frozen until the court can review the case. Your access to company funds, the investment accounts, even the house you're sitting in right now, everything is locked down pending judicial review. The irony wasn't lost on me. 24 hours ago, I'd been worth $2.5 billion. Now I couldn't legally spend a dime of it. How long does a review take? Months, maybe longer if they drag it out with appeals and procedural challenges. Morrison, Blake specializes in estate litigation. They know how to make these cases expensive and time-consuming. That evening, the second wave hit through social media and local news outlets. Someone had leaked details of the will reading to a business reporter, but the story that emerged bore little resemblance to what actually happened in that conference room. Family claims inheritance fraud, read the headline across my laptop screen. The article painted me as a manipulative outsider who'd exploited an elderly man's loneliness to steal a pharmaceutical fortune from his rightful heirs. Tavrik was quoted extensively. My father was isolated and vulnerable in his final years. Kieran took advantage of that isolation to poison Viktor's mind against his own family. This wasn't inheritance. It was theft disguised as generosity. Celine's statement was even more damaging. Viktor always had a soft spot for people he felt sorry for. Kieran manipulated that kindness, convincing a dying man that his successful family members were somehow unworthy while he deserved everything. It's heartbreaking to watch someone's final wishes being distorted by greed. The comments section beneath the article filled with strangers debating my character based on accusations they'd read in a newspaper. Within hours, the story had been picked up by financial blogs, pharmaceutical trade publications, and social media accounts that specialized in corporate drama. By morning, my name was associated with fraud, manipulation, and elder abuse across dozens of websites I'd never heard of. The third attack was the most personal. My phone started ringing at 5 a.m. with calls from blocked numbers. When I answered, automated voices would play recordings of family members discussing my mental instability and history of financial desperation. Someone had clearly hired a service to flood my phone with harassment. My apartment's buzzer rang constantly with fake delivery notifications designed to keep me from sleeping. Anonymous emails filled my inbox with legal threats, character assassinations, and detailed descriptions of what would happen to me when the real Draveth family reclaimed their inheritance. But the moment that truly shook me came when I arrived at my part-time accounting job to find my supervisor, Marcus Chen, waiting by my desk with an uncomfortable expression. "Kieran, we need to talk," he said, gesturing toward his office. Inside, he closed the door and sat heavily behind his desk. "I got 3 calls yesterday from potential clients who saw the news coverage. They're concerned about having someone involved in a high-profile legal dispute handling their financial records." My stomach dropped. "Marcus, you know me. You know I'm honest." "I do know you. That's what makes this so hard." He rubbed his temples. "But I also know I can't afford to lose clients over association with a scandal, even if the scandal is fabricated." "You're firing me." "I'm suspending you until this gets resolved." "I'm sorry, Kieran. I really am." Walking out of that office felt like losing the last connection to my old life. The job hadn't paid much, but it had given me purpose, routine, independence. Now even that was gone, stripped away by people who'd already taken everything else. That night, sitting in Viktor's study, surrounded by legal documents I couldn't access and business plans I couldn't implement, I finally understood the full scope of what my family had orchestrated. They weren't just challenging the will, they were systematically destroying my ability to function while the legal process played out. Without access to Viktor's accounts, I couldn't afford the kind of legal representation needed to fight Morrison, Blake, and Associates. Without my job, I couldn't even pay my basic living expenses. Without public support, I was fighting a war of perception that I was already losing. For the first time since Viktor's death, I felt the weight of genuine despair. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was just a part-time bookkeeper who'd gotten lucky and would inevitably lose everything to people who understood power better than I ever would. That's when I noticed Viktor's final letter still sitting on his desk and realized I hadn't finished reading it. I picked up Viktor's letter with trembling hands, finding my place where I'd stopped reading days earlier. The next paragraph made my breath catch. "If you're reading this section, then they've likely launched their counterattack. Legal challenges. Media manipulation, personal harassment. I've seen this family operate for decades, and their playbook never changes. They'll try to isolate you, bankrupt you, and destroy your reputation before you can learn to use the tools I've left you. Viktor had predicted everything. The injunction, the news stories, the systematic destruction of my credibility. He'd known exactly how his family would respond to losing their inheritance. But what they don't know is that I've been documenting their behavior for years. Hidden cameras in my office captured Draveth discussing plans to have me declared mentally incompetent. Recorded phone calls reveal Celine's attempts to manipulate my medical care to accelerate my death. Email records show Isabella coordinating with pharmaceutical competitors to undermine our research programs. My hands were shaking as I continued reading. Viktor hadn't just been evaluating me during our secret meetings. He'd been building a case against the rest of the family. The evidence is stored in a security deposit box at Millbrook First National, box number 847. The key is taped under the bottom drawer of my desk. Use this information wisely and remember that justice delayed is not justice denied. I found the key exactly where Viktor said it would be. The next morning, despite my frozen assets and legal restrictions, I drove to the bank using what little cash I had left. The security deposit box contained a folder thick enough to choke a horse. Inside were photographs, audio recordings, financial documents, and medical records that painted a picture of systematic elder abuse, corporate sabotage, and fraud that stretched back years. The smoking gun was a recorded conversation between Draveth and a pharmaceutical lobbyist, discussing plans to secretly sell Draveth's most valuable patents to a Chinese competitor for personal profit, while Viktor was still alive. The transaction would have destroyed the company's research capabilities while funneling millions into offshore accounts. I called the FBI that afternoon. Agent Sarah Kelvane arrived at my apartment within hours, reviewed Viktor's evidence, and confirmed what I'd suspected. My family hadn't just been morally corrupt, they'd been criminally negligent. "This is enough for federal charges," she said, closing the folder. "Wire fraud, elder abuse, conspiracy to commit corporate espionage. Your uncle built an airtight case." The arrests began the next day. Draveth was taken into custody at his office, handcuffed in front of the pharmaceutical executives he'd been trying to impress. Celine was arrested at her country club during her weekly bridge game. Isabella's arrest made the evening news when federal agents escorted her out of a charity gala in downtown Thornfield. The media coverage shifted overnight. Pharmaceutical heirs arrested in fraud scandal replaced the stories questioning my inheritance. Viktor's recorded evidence became public record, revealing the systematic way they'd planned to destroy both him and the company he'd built. Morrison, Blake & Associates withdrew their challenge to the will within 48 hours. The assets were unfrozen by court order the following week. And for the first time since Viktor's death, I could breathe again, knowing that truth had finally won over manipulation. 6 months later, I stood in the newly renovated lobby of Draveth Pharmaceuticals, watching employees stream through doors that now displayed a different kind of corporate messaging. Where Viktor's original mission statement had focused on excellence in pharmaceutical innovation, the new banners read, "Healing people, advancing medicine, serving humanity." The changes went far beyond cosmetic updates. In my first 100 days as chairman, we'd restructured the company's entire approach to drug development and distribution. The patent hoarding strategy that had made my family wealthy was replaced with a model that prioritized patient access alongside profit margins. Our first major initiative tackled the insulin pricing crisis that had been affecting diabetic patients for years. Instead of maximizing profits on life-saving medication, we partnered with generic manufacturers to create affordable alternatives while maintaining our research funding through other products. The decision cost us millions in potential revenue, but it saved lives and restored faith in pharmaceutical companies as healers rather than exploiters. Marcus Chen, my former supervisor, had become our director of financial transparency, implementing systems that made our pricing decisions public and accountable. "You're proving something important," he told me during one of our weekly strategy meetings. "That success doesn't require abandoning principles." The transformation extended beyond corporate policy to corporate culture. We instituted profit-sharing programs that gave every employee, from research scientists to maintenance staff, a stake in the company's success. We established an employee-led ethics committee with the authority to question executive decisions that seemed to prioritize shareholders over patients. Most significantly, we launched the Viktor Draveth Foundation for Ethical Pharmaceuticals, using 20% of our annual profits to fund research into treatments for rare diseases that major companies typically ignored because the patient populations were too small to generate significant revenue. The Foundation's first project focused on developing affordable treatments for pediatric cancers in developing countries. Working with international medical organizations, we created a distribution network that provided medications at cost to hospitals that couldn't afford market prices. But the project that meant the most to me personally was the Employee Family Support Initiative. Too many companies treated their workers, relatives, as irrelevant to corporate success. But I'd learned firsthand how family dynamics could either support or undermine professional achievement. We instituted family counseling programs, educational scholarships for employees, children regardless of academic performance, and mentorship opportunities that connected young family members with industry professionals. The program was designed around a simple principle: everyone deserves support and recognition, not just the family members who fit traditional definitions of success. Isabella was the first family member to reach out after the legal proceedings concluded. She served 18 months of community service and faced professional sanctions that effectively ended her career in pharmaceuticals, but she avoided prison time by cooperating with federal investigators. "I want to understand what you're building," she said during our first conversation in over a year. We met at the coffee shop where Viktor and I had conducted our secret meetings, surrounded by the same ordinary people living ordinary lives that I'd once felt so disconnected from. "I'm not building anything," I told her. "I'm continuing something Viktor started and trying not to break it in the process. The foundation, the pricing changes, the employee programs, that's not continuation, that's revolution." I stirred my coffee, thinking about Viktor's voice on those recordings, his disappointment with a family that had confused wealth with worth. Maybe revolution is just what continuation looks like when you've been heading in the wrong direction for too long. Isabella nodded slowly. "Can I help? Not for money, or forgiveness or redemption, just because I want to do something that matters." That conversation led to Isabella joining our foundation as a volunteer coordinator, using her business skills to organize medical missions and coordinate with international health organizations. Watching her find purpose in service rather than acquisition felt like witnessing someone discover a language they'd never known they could speak. Tavrik and Celine faced federal prison sentences and showed no interest in rebuilding relationships or contributing to positive change. Some people, I learned, are too invested in their grievances to accept opportunities for growth. But their absence created space for different kinds of relationships. The foundation attracted volunteers from across the pharmaceutical industry, medical professionals, and patient advocacy groups who shared Viktor's vision of medicine as a healing art rather than merely a business opportunity. 2 years after inheriting Draveth Pharmaceuticals, I received a letter from a mother in Guatemala whose daughter had received cancer treatment through our foundation's international program. The girl was 7 years old, the same age I'd been when Viktor first told me that helping people was more important than helping yourself. "Your company saved my daughter's life," the letter read in careful English. "But more than that, you showed us that some people still remember medicine is about love." That letter sits framed on Viktor's old desk, next to the fishing photo he'd left for me and the tie clip he'd hidden at his funeral. They remind me daily that inheritance isn't about what someone leaves you. It's about what you do with what you've been given. The pharmaceutical industry still has problems that can't be solved by one company or one foundation. But we've proven that business success and ethical behavior aren't mutually exclusive, that profit and principle can coexist, and that sometimes the person everyone calls insignificant might be the one who understands significance best. Viktor was right about character being more valuable than credentials. But what he taught me through his careful planning was that character without power is just good intentions, while power without character is just sophisticated cruelty. The real inheritance he left me wasn't money or property or corporate control. It was the understanding that true significance comes from lifting others up, not from climbing over them. And that legacy is something no court can freeze, no family can steal, and no amount of money can buy. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.